Does Riot punish champions who've been in the meta for too long? Do you consider there to be value in there being a rotated meta? Yes and no. So we don't necessarily go in and say, this character has been meta for 2 months, therefore they should be destroyed. Like, that's not a balanced strategy. Therefore, one thing we do care about is staleness. Staleness is the idea that, like, League of Legends is a better game when it changes over time. And so if League of Legends just stayed the same game for months at a time, we believe that actually wouldn't be the best version of the game or the most enjoyable game to play over the long term. And so we will actively look for staleness in the meta and sometimes adjust characters up or down to improve staleness. And this can result in nerfs. So this could be like, Graves has been really powerful for months. And while we don't think he is overpowered, he's been so strong for so long that shaking up the meta by giving him a small nerf might be good for the game. That's an example. Another example could be Vlad hasn't been touched in a year, and he actually feels kind of weak. And he's not like super weak in terms of immediately needing a buff, but the fact that he hasn't been touched in a year has made him a pretty stale feeling character. So let's mix up Vlad and mix up the meta by buffing Vlad a little bit, right? It can result in buffs or nerfs. But yes, staleness is something we do care about. Staleness is especially important actually in pro play because we find that players tend to get very quickly upset at characters that stay meta in pro for very long amounts of time. And like most characters aren't immune to the upsetness basically. And so sometimes you'll like, an easy example of this is like sometimes when a character comes into meta, the initial reaction from players, when I say players, I don't mean pro players, I mean all of you who watch the game. The initial reaction often is very positive. It's like, oh my god, UwU is finally meta. It's been years. It's so cool to see him. But then that positive reaction can quickly turn negative. Oh yeah, it was like, you know, when UwU showed up in the pro meta years ago, a number of years ago before his rework, and the initial reaction to him was very positive. People were like, oh my god, it's UwU. I've never seen that guy in pro. It's so cool to see him there. But then that reaction quickly turned very, very negative once he became meta for a long period of time. And you see this happen with many, many different characters. The difference between a character to like players who watch pro being like fair and well balanced and not can often be just how often have they been played recently. And so staleness is definitely something that is valuable to consider with pro, which is one of the reasons I'm really excited for Fearless Draft. I honestly think that the need to modulate staleness in pro often forces us to nerf characters who legitimately don't deserve it. And I think Fearless Draft is going to help a lot with that staleness, such that long term, I would guess that we'll have to nerf less characters for pro than we have in the past. How can you nurture a non-FF culture when you make snowballing so easy? This new patch coming out, you're making it so much harder for a team that's behind to catch up. With the feats of strength, for example. If that is the case, if it is not worth catching up, we'd probably need to make adjustments. But I'll say something about forfeiting that I think is important, is something you want to avoid is it's a concept we call trapped games. What a trapped game is a game where you have lost the game, but the game has not ended. And when I say lost the game, I don't mean you're at a disadvantage. I don't mean, oh, they're ahead 1,000 gold, we've lost. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a game where it's like, it is highly, highly, highly unlikely that you will ever come back. And at that point, it generally is better for the game to end. It's not great to be in a trapped game. And so to modulate trapped games, you need to either give players tools to end the game, one of those tools being forfeiting, or you need to make it easier to come back. But of course, there's only a certain amount of comeback that the game should have before leads don't matter, right? So it's a fine balance between leads matter and getting ahead matters versus you have a reasonable feeling that, you know, if you do something, you could potentially come back. This is why things like gold kill bounties are good for the game, right? Where it's like, hey, that guy's really far ahead. We're probably going to lose. But hey, if we kill him, we'll get some gold back and, you know, maybe we have a chance, right? And so trapped games is something we think about a lot. And that's probably one of the things the team is going to be looking at, you know, with the upcoming changes to like the game and snowballing and stuff is like, you know, if a team gets ahead with whatever these bonuses are, how likely is that to mean that the enemy team can't come back? In what situations? Things like that. It's all a balance. That said, though, I know there's a number of people who don't like forfeiting. There's a number of people and streamers who will say, like, forfeiting is bad, Riot shouldn't let you forfeit, this is a competitive game, when you queue up for a competitive game, you should expect to finish it, things like that, right? I get where you're coming from there. The thing you have to modulate that against, though, is, like, players being in games that are, like, likely to be miserable experiences for them. And so I generally actually am in the camp of allowing teams to forfeit is a good thing. And I think 4 of the 5 votes being enough for it is correct. I think it would be incorrect if it was like 3-2, but 4 to 5 I think is good. And the reason I think it's good is because you don't want players like trapped in games that are like likely to be miserable and feel pointless. But then I'm combine that with this other statement is like we looked into the data of like players forfeiting, right? And we found that players generally are pretty knowledgeable about when they're going to lose the game if there's like a majority forfeit. So I'm not talking about like when one random guy is tilted and he spams the forfeit vote and then everybody else turns it down. I'm not talking about situations like that. But in situations where players forfeit the game and they get that majority to actually call the forfeit, we looked at the data for those games and we found that players are actually very in the know about games that are losable. I mean, sorry, winnable versus losable. Like, at the point where a game gets to the point where 4 of the 5 people want to forfeit, it is very often the case that forfeiting was, like, a reasonable decision. And it was, at that point, unlikely that they were going to come back. So players tend to have a good pulse on how far they are behind when they actually choose to fully forfeit a game. Again, assuming that the majority of the people in the lobby feel that way. Counterpoint, Azep is cool? Oh, Azep is cool. And by the way, to give you the other perspective, Azep also, by the way, is right. And what I mean by he's right is, technically, you should never forfeit. Like, if you want to have the highest win rate possible, never forfeit the game for any reason. Because every game is winnable. Literally every game is winnable. They could DC. Oh, you're down 20,000 gold? Maybe the enemy team DCs. Like, actually, right? And so if your mindset is you should never forfeit because every game can be won, I don't think that's an unreasonable mindset to have because you're right. It's true. So yeah, if you don't like forfeiting, all the power to you. But I think it's also important in a game like League that we don't stick players in games that they're very likely to lose and allow them to like get out if they believe they're not going to win it. And we find that players generally have a pretty accurate perception when it comes to like 4 people in the game voting to forfeit whether or not that game was going to be winnable or not. But if you want to climb the ladder, you want to have the absolute highest win rate possible, never forfeit.